From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Library of Congress. There are lots of seats up front, folks, if you'd like to come on up. I won't point you out at all. I'm John Cole. I'm the director of the Center for the Book in the Library of Congress, which is the part of the library that promotes books and reading and literacy in libraries. We are really in the educational outreach business for the library and part of a newly organized department that talks about national and international outreach. We have affiliates in every state, and they help us promote books and reading, often through statewide book festivals, sometimes through author awards programs, other ways that are local, and the business they're really in is promoting writers and authors and book things in their states. And so we enjoy having those state contacts, and it's important for the work that we're doing in other areas. Another major involvement for us is with the Library of Congress National Book Festival, which has existed. We had our 15th anniversary this year. It was created with the library by Laura Bush when she was the First Lady, and she stuck with us, thank goodness, for all 8 years of the Bushes were here. And the President Obama and Mrs. Obama became our honorary chairs after the Bushes left. And we have picked up steam. We were for the first 13 years on the National Mall and sort of got moved off as the mall underwent renovation last year, and we grew rather large, and we've moved into the Washington Convention Center, where we have been very happily ensconced the last 2 years and in the future. The book festival is a wonderful public outreach event for the Library of Congress. And one of the best parts is all of the Library of Congress volunteers and others from throughout the library and our friends help out. And the Convention Center put out a statistic last year, which we didn't do the counting, nor did we ask for the publicity, but they said that the National Book Festival last September 5th was the largest single event ever held at the Washington Convention Center, and they estimated a crowd between 125 and 150,000, which was really wonderful. Well, that was all. Thank you on behalf of the library and all of the people who worked on it, because it's just a wonderful event. Here at the library, to get down to business, one of our major programs is the one you're attending, called Books and Beyond. And these are book talks by authors of relatively recent books, and each of the books has something to do with the Library of Congress. And we co-sponsor these often with our custodial divisions, meaning manuscripts or prints and photographs, where very often the book, the research, the speaker, the author has done their work in the Library of Congress's collections. Other talks, such as the one today, have a very obvious connection with the library in a functional way. Often also we work with the Folk Life Center or others on special projects that have been of interest to the Center for the Book. One example that comes to mind is the WPA Arts Projects and the various books that have come out relating to the WPA Arts Projects. These programs are all filmed for the Library of Congress's website, so I ask you to turn off all things electronic. The format will be a presentation by our speaker, who will be introduced by a distinguished member of the Congressional Research Staff. He will speak for 30 to 40 minutes. We'll have a chance for questions and answers, and we'll have a book signing here in the back of the room that needs to start no later than 1 o'clock. And of course, our book today is Underdog Politics. Our author is Matt Green. I want to say a couple of things about the Center for the Book, a couple of more things. The schedule of future talks is on the back. in the back. We also have an evaluation form, which really focuses on how you learned about the program. So we're trying to coordinate with the other Library of Congress public programs, including author programs, to learn more about how that happened. Finally, I would like to introduce Walter Olasak, who is from the Congressional Research Service. Walter is a senior specialist, he said, in Congress in general. He's a generalist who's been at the Library of Congress for a number of years. We actually have rediscovered our long friendship. I started in the Congressional Research Service my first 2 years at the library between 1966 and 1968, beating Walter by 2 years. But I left CRS, then called Legislative Reference Service, in 1968, the year that Walter arrived. But we had overlap, and we've said hello to each other and known each other in an informal way for what amounts to be several decades. So it's a special pleasure to introduce Walter, who will carry on with our program. Let's give Walter a hand.
Well, thank you, John, for that kind introduction. I got to thank John not only personally, but of course the Center for the Book, which sponsors these kinds of programs, which is really a tremendous educative event for all LC employees who are interested in attending these kinds of forums. And we're going to have an intellectual treat today, a feast over this lunch hour, because we have Professor Matthew Green with us, who, as we all know, will talk about, when he gets to the podium momentarily, about underdog politics. Just a little about Matt, and that is he's a PhD from Yale University. He's a very busy and active researcher at Catholic University, where he's been since he started his academic career. He is, in terms of busyness, I would commend that you go look at his website, because his website lists his numerous publications, all of his articles, convention papers, blogs, C-SPAN interviews, and it goes on. So he's going to expand our horizons in a lot of ways by talking about this issue of underdog politics. I want to also highlight that Matt has published 2 very important books on the United States House. One in 2010, and that was The Speaker of the House, A Study in Leadership. And of course now, 5 years later, we have Underdog Politics. Now, it's an interesting title because generally that's the way the minority party often feels, as the underdog in the House of Representatives particularly. It varies over time, but I'm fond of a quote by former Speaker Thomas Sarr Reed of Maine in the late 19th century when he was Speaker, and he had a comment that sometimes resonates even today, and he said that the job of the minority party is twofold. Number 1, make a quorum. Number 2, draw your pay, and the rest of the time leave governance to the majority party, which happened to be the Republicans at that time. So without further ado, because time is limited, let me now welcome Matt Green to the podium, where he'll speak for whatever length of time he needs to run through the PowerPoints, and then take Q&A, and then we'll have to break. So with that, Professor Green.
Thank you, Walter, for that kind introduction. I have many people to thank for being here. I want to thank Mr. Cole for having me come and speak to you today about my book. I also, in addition to this book being relevant because it's about Congress, can people hear me, or should I talk in the mic? The mic? Mic better? Okay. In addition to the book being about Congress, I also took advantage of the Library of Congress and did some of the research for this book at the Library of Congress's various collections, newspaper collections, and also some congressional record analysis. And then in addition to that, in a very early stage of this project, Colleen Shogan invited me to present a portion of my research to the Government and Finance Division of CRS, which was extremely helpful and got a lot of excellent and helpful feedback and advice and suggestions for the project. And actually it was there that someone from CRS, Jim Saturno, suggested, why don't you make this a book? And I hadn't thought about that. I just thought this was going to be a little fun project. And I thought, that actually would be quite a lot of fun to do. And so I ended up several years later publishing this book. So I have Mr. Saturno to thank, and also folks at CRS and Library of Congress. So let me start by, to introduce this subject, talk about 3 policy changes of varying significance that have happened in the last 30 years in the United States. The first is the passage of the 1981 budget proposal by President Ronald Reagan, which dramatically reduced taxes. The second is the closure of hundreds of military bases across the United States in the last several decades. And the third is the fact, this is a little bit more minor, that the House of Representatives starts each day with the Pledge of Allegiance. Now, the reason why I start with these 3 is because they have something in common. It's not that they have a president behind them. It's not that a majority party in the House and or Senate were behind them, but that they took place in part because of the initiatives and efforts of members of the minority party of the House of Representatives. The Reagan budget got its start with a tax reduction proposal introduced by then Congressman Jack Kemp, Republican from New York, who was in the minority, along with Senator Roth from Delaware. BRAC got its start with an amendment that was proposed by then minority, member of the minority, Dick Armey of Texas. And the State of the Union, the Pledge of Allegiance got its start during the 1988 presidential campaign, when the issue of the constitutionality of the Pledge of Allegiance became an issue. There was a bill that Dukakis had vetoed, so Bush was saying, what's your problem with the Pledge of Allegiance? So House Republicans started saying we should require the Pledge of Allegiance when the House meets. And Democrats tried to sort of hold them off, but ultimately agreed to do it, at least informally. So these are examples of ways in which we've had policy changes or procedural changes because of the minority party in the House of Representatives. Now, I think this is important for a number of reasons. One is that the conventional wisdom is that the minority party in the House doesn't really matter. If you have to be in the minority, it's the Senate where you want to be, not the House of Representatives. It's a majoritarian institution. The majority sets the rules, the majority sets the agenda, etc. The other thing, too, which is what got me interested in this as well, is not just contributions to policy and procedure by members of the minority, but that even when the minority party doesn't seem to have much influence, it still is active. It doesn't give up. And that got me thinking about why minority parties do what they do. There were a couple actually specific instances in recent years that piqued my curiosity. One was the frequent use by the minority Democrats in the 1990s and early 2000s of procedural motions, particularly the motion to rise and the motion to adjourn, which I'll talk about in a minute, which slow things down, but they're not exactly a filibuster. So I started thinking, why would a minority be doing these things? It just caused a little bit of difficulty, I suppose. And the other was in 2008. I was fortunate enough to bring my then 3-month-old daughter to the House floor in the summer of 2008 when the House Republicans were staging this sort of mock session talking about oil prices. And it was not televised. And it was sort of fun to watch, but I thought, now, why are these folks doing this? It's not on TV. Why would they stay here instead of go home for the summer and talk to a chamber full of tourists, if anyone, about oil prices? So that got me thinking about the minority party some more, and I started to do more research, and ultimately ended up with this book. So the book addresses, or at least raises, 4 questions. The first is, why does the House minority party, or what does the minority party do? Right? There are categories of activities that they do. The second is why. Why do they do the things that they do? The third is, have the things that the minority party, the things that they do, has it changed over time? And the fourth is whether it has any effects on politics or policy. Now, I am not going to answer all 4 questions in my talk. Some of those are answered in the book, and in the interest of time, I don't want to go through each. I should also, as a caveat, mention that the last question is the hardest to answer. And in the book, I suggest an answer to it, and that it may vary by the tactic that's used. But I don't have a definitive answer. It's very hard to draw causal connections between the things a party does in the minority and the political outcomes that they may be seeking. All right, well, let me start actually, and I'll just go back to this for a second, the order in which I'm going to tackle these questions. I'm going to start with number 2, talk about why the minority party does what it does. Then I'll talk about what the minority party does, and I'll give some examples. The book is chock full of these things that they do, and I'm not going to talk about all of them. And then I will, in doing so, talk a little bit about 4 and maybe touch on 3 at the end, time permitting. And I should mention one other thing, too, about the presentation. You're going to see some graphs. You're going to see some tables. But this book is, I would say, relatively unusual for a political science book, particularly about Congress. There's no formal models, no mathematical models. There's not a single regression equation in it anywhere. Thank you. My purpose was to make it readable and interesting. And so I hope I succeeded. Okay, so let me start by talking about why the minority party does what it does. Well, the obvious and most important thing to a minority party is to not be a minority anymore. It is not fun to be in the minority in the House of Representatives. So their primary goal is to be a majority, to win seats from the majority, and to be a majority party again. Now, the conventional wisdom would stop there. See, that's what the minority cares about. But what I argue in the book is that that's incomplete. That doesn't help us explain things that they do that may be out of the public eye or that aren't relevant to voters. There's other things going on there. So there's 3 other important collective goals to the minority party, I argue. The second is policy. Because even though they're in the minority, members of the minority party are lawmakers. They want to make the law. They want to influence legislation. And so the extent that they can do that, it's important to the party collectively. Third important goal of the minority party is the protection of its procedural rights. Now, for the most part, these rights are a necessary precondition to do other things. You've got to have certain powers in order to influence policy, for instance. But I argue that these rights are also important to the minority in and of themselves. They're especially sensitive to it because they have fewer rights under the rules. And so they want to protect the prerogatives that they have. And they can get quite passionate about it if they feel that those rights are being violated or their powers are being mitigated. And the fourth thing that matters to the minority is a successful presidential party. Now, this matters to the majority party too, of course, but especially to the minority because you want to have some ally somewhere in the national government who can help you, can carry out your policy goals. If you're in the so-called deep minority, so your party does not have the Senate or the White House, then you are truly powerless. So I argue these are 4 very important things to the minority. Now, important thing to note here, these aren't all equally important. Most of the time, this is in the order in which they matter to a minority party. But it will also vary by circumstances. So in the 1970s, for instance, many House Republicans saw no way to get into the majority. They just could not see a way to do it. So for many of them, the second goal was the primary one. Well, if we can't win back the House, let's at least try to influence policy. And this became a major conflict when Newt Gingrich was elected to the House because he was trying to convince the party that majority status should be number 1 versus others who were there saying that's silly, which should be number 2. One other thing I want to note before I talk about some things in particular that the minority party does. That table is sort of a kind of what you might call in political science a rational choice approach. So the idea is that the party is calculating, they think about what matters most to them, and they figure out how to get them. Well, something that's important that I discovered in my interviews that I did for this book and other research is that that's a little simplistic, that other things matter to the minority too. And I open the book with these 2 quotes, and I highlight 2 key words there to underscore an important common sense that the minority party has: frustration and freedom. So on the one hand, it's very frustrating to be in the minority and to lose over and over and over again. On the other hand, you have no obligations. You're not governing. You can do what you like. And so because these are 2 important characteristics of life in the minority, there are some consequences to how a minority party behaves. Morale. Morale is very hard to keep. It's very hard to keep good morale when you're in the minority, and it's a constant struggle for leaders to keep the morale of their fellow partisans high. If you can't, they may leave. They may not cooperate or work with the party on things that they need. So this is often a sort of underlying theme of minority party politics, is keeping people's morale high. Emotion also matters. Sometimes the majority does something that's so infuriating to the minority that they just do something. Right? They stage a protest or they try something more out of anger and frustration than out of a calculated analysis of what will work. And then also action as its own reward. A couple folks I talked to said that leaders felt the need to do something. You got to show the troops that you're doing something, even if it's not going to bring you back in the majority anytime soon. And that can be inherently rewarding. And there are certainly some members of the minority who just like the fight. They just enjoy the battle for its own sake. And then uncertainty. So there's a lot of uncertainty. Sometimes people in the minority just try things. They don't know if it's going to work or not. If it doesn't, it probably won't make a difference. So these are 4 important themes of the book, or sort of leitmotifs of the book. Okay, what I'd like to do now is talk about each of these 4 categories of tactics that the minority party uses. Now, here on the slide, I show all the things that I discuss under each headline. I'm not going to talk about all of those in my presentation. I'm going to highlight one as an example for each of these 4 categories. So electioneering, messaging, obstructing, and legislating. Let me start with electioneering, and the example I want to give is the use by really both parties of a technique to identify strong candidates and help them with training and fundraising. So this is one way a minority can try to get back the majority, is find people running, particularly if they're running against incumbents from the other party, and say, you're promising, we're going to help you raise more money and help you succeed. So these are, for instance, the Red to Blue program that the Democrats started in the early 2000s, and the Young Guns program that Republicans started in 2010. And they've been fairly successful. So Kirsten Gillibrand was elected as a Red to Blue in 2006. Alan West from Florida was elected in the Young Guns program. But what I want to talk about is not whether it led to Democrats or Republicans winning, but a more immediate goal. Did it actually help these candidates raise more money? Was it successful? So let me just show one example of this. They've got more examples in the book. This is early 2006. This is the year the Democrats retake the House. And the Red to Blue program is targeting a number of Democrats that they find promising. So what I have here on the table, the blue are Democrats running who get put into or accepted into the Red to Blue program. And the first set of bars are before they are put in the program or allowed in, and then the second set are afterwards. And I compare each of those Red to Blue candidates with another Democrat running from a similar district who had showed at least some degree of fundraising acumen. So not extremely minor candidates, but fairly strong ones. The first thing to see, of course, is that you don't get into Red to Blue program unless you're already good at raising money. That shouldn't be a surprise. But what I show here, and I also show elsewhere in the book, is that after they're in one of these programs like Red to Blue, these candidates do better at raising money than those who are not in the program. In this case, the Red to Blue candidates raised about $120,000 collectively over and above what they had raised in the first quarter of 2006, whereas the matched pairs, the ones in red, had only raised about half that much, $60,000. So it's an example of ways in which the minority party tries to win seats. And of course, again, the majority party does this as well, I should note. All right, next I want to talk about messaging. Messaging is something that you see all the time in Congress, and it's something that is particularly emphasized, or at least has been recently, by minority parties. So John Boehner, for instance, after Republicans lost the House in 2006, was quoted as saying, we have to forget that we're legislators, but we can be communicators. That's what we have to do. And both parties, when they're in the minority, have emphasized communication and messaging. So there's all kinds of ways that you can get your message out. And what I want to talk about today is just one kind of messaging tool, which are 1-minute floor speeches. So this is at the beginning of each session when a number of members prepared to give their speeches. They ask unanimous consent to address the floor for 1 minute, and they can talk about really whatever they want. Although, as I discuss in the book, it's become increasingly the party agenda, what they talk about. So I like to have one Democrat and one Republican here, but I couldn't help myself. I had to put Jim Traficant on this because he was just such a colorful speaker in his 1 minute, both in the majority and in the minority. So what I do in the book is I look at whether or not these things might influence public opinion. Messaging could have all kinds of effects that are hard to measure, but one immediate possible effect would be, does it move the public in the direction that the party wants it to? So I looked at, there's so many of these 1 minutes, and I could not code them all. So I took samples every 5 years and coded them for content, and then I'll talk about a case study involving a really assertive use of these and whether it moved the public in the direction that the party wanted. So this is a chart that shows the percent of 1 minutes given by the minority and majority party that talked about the president or the presidential candidate. The circles are the majority party, and the squares are the minority party. In addition, if they're hollow, it means that the party does not control the White House. So it's the opposite party that's in the White House. And what I found, I sort of thought, well, maybe the minority would be biased towards the president or something like that. What I actually found is both parties care about the president, but really only when the president is of the opposite party. That's when you see a larger percentage of their 1 minutes talking about the president. So for instance, in 1990, for example, or let's take 1985, doesn't really matter. 1985, the Republicans are in the minority, and Reagan is president, but it's the majority party Democrats that are talking about the president. So there's a way in which both parties sort of see their role as oppositional in their messaging with respect to the president, depending on who that president is. There is, however, a definite difference between the majority-minority party on partisanship. Majority tends to talk more about party and partisanship than the majority party does. And here's where one of those other collective goals comes into play. The minority talks a lot more about procedure than the majority does in their 1 minutes. Now, they don't talk that much about it. No more than about 5.5% of their 1 minutes are on that subject. But that's something that also matters to the minority, is procedure and how the House is working. And most of these speeches are, unsurprisingly, complaining about procedure and the way it's being misused by the majority party. So do these have any effect? Well, as I said, what I do in the book is I look at the relationship with public opinion. So let me give a case study here of a use of 1 minutes by House Republicans in mid-2009, July 2009. The Republicans decide their big theme is going to be jobs. So they have everybody go to the floor and give 1 minute speeches and use the same phrase, where are the jobs? They repeat that over and over and over. Where are the jobs? Where are the jobs? That's in every 1 minute speech practically. So there's a Republican polling firm that asked a question of folks, what matters most to you when you're thinking about your vote for Congress? And they asked this question in early June 2009, and they found about 37% of respondents said the economy, and 5% said jobs. After Boehner had, the minority leader Boehner and other Republicans had done this where are the jobs campaign, the same polling firm asked the same question, and this was the results. Now, exact same percentage on the economy and a 1% increase in those saying jobs, which of course is well within the margin of error. And I discuss in the book other cases in which you don't see the public moving as a result of these kinds of messaging. Now, does that mean messaging doesn't work? Not necessarily. It could have longer term effects. It could also do some of the things that I talked about earlier. It can boost morale for the party, makes members feel like they're doing something to try to get out of their minority status. But if the goal is to move the needle of the public opinion in one direction, it doesn't seem to have much of an effect. Okay, third category of tactics is delaying and obstructing. This is a chapter I particularly enjoyed writing because it just strikes me as peculiar to think about the minority in the House as trying to delay and obstruct. This is not the Senate. They don't have a filibuster. So what kinds of things can they do to slow things down? There are things, in fact, that they can do to slow things down. And I talk in the book about some notorious examples, which I can discuss in Q&A later. One of my favorites involved Don Rumsfeld in 1968 and something that he led. But I'm going to talk instead today about motions to rise and motions to adjourn. So these are procedural motions in the House of Representatives. The motion to adjourn is a motion to basically end the session, to be done for the day. Motion to rise is if the House is meeting in the committee of the whole to consider amendments, and then you rise. This would be to end that portion of the discussion and leave the committee of the whole. So I asked two questions in the book. One is, why are they being done? And second of all, do they yield results? So let me just first show a chart demonstrating how often these are done. You can see they were very rare. These are done by, this is minority party motions to rise and adjourn, I should say. Very, very rare. Became more popular in the early 90s, really took off a couple of key Congresses, and have sort of died down again in terms of popularity. These are useful for slowing things down, not a whole lot, because you do one, you have a roll call vote, that takes 15 minutes. But sometimes the minority does them over and over and over and over again. That can slow things down considerably. So what I did for these motions is I looked to see if the member of Congress who offered them gave an explanation. So went to the floor and said, I'm really mad you wouldn't let me offer my amendment. I move we adjourn. Or, it's ridiculous we're debating gun control and we should be debating something else. I move that the committee rise. Now, only about half of these motions is there an explanation. But of those half, this is the percentage that fall into each category. I categorized them based on the general concern, complaint, comment that was being made. And just the takeaway point from this is that some of these, they could be explained by the minority caring about re-election, because if you can't offer your amendment because of an unfair floor rule, then you can't get your message out. You can't change the bill the way you want, so also policy concerns. But some of these things are very arcane, violation of regular order, some other abuse of power. And I would here quote Robert Michael, former Republican minority leader, who called a lot of these kinds of debates "me-go," my eyes glaze over. And this is boring stuff for most people. They don't care about motions. They don't care about the restrictiveness of a rule. So here's where it's important to understand the minority caring about how it's treated, about its procedural rights. And here's something that I found interesting, that it's hard to necessarily trace the causal connection that these motions to rise or adjourn were used and then this change happened as a result. But nonetheless, a good percentage of these were then followed by some kind of change, either a bill being changed or amendments being allowed or the agenda being altered to help the minority party. So this at least suggests that these can be effective, not in the majority of times, but they can be effective in helping the minority. All right, the last subject that I want to talk about, or last category of tactics, is legislating. So this is one in which I actually originally wasn't going to have this in the book. So I thought, the minority doesn't really legislate that much. But the reviewer said, you've got to talk about legislating. Surely that matters with Congress, right? Okay, so I did. So I added a chapter about legislating. And I look at different ways the minority can legislate, can influence legislation. Yes, the minority is outnumbered, but that doesn't mean that it can't win. The most common way of measuring if a minority wins in a floor vote is through what's called a majority roll. That's if the majority party votes against something, but it still passes. We colloquially now call this a violation of the Hastert rule. And we've seen that violation a number of times, though it's not technically a rule, more of a norm. And so we've seen that this can happen, and it can happen on really big bills. But a lot of scholars say, well, this doesn't happen that much, so really minority doesn't have that much influence. One of the things I argue in the book is that, besides the fact that these happen on pretty important things, is that there are other ways the minority wins on floor votes besides these rolls. So this chart shows three kinds of votes. The blue line shows the percentage of votes on final passage in which the majority was rolled, a violation of a Hastert rule. As you can see, it doesn't happen very often. However, if you include amendments, that's the red line, it does happen more often. And then, if you look at the times that the majority either loses a bill it wants to pass or a bill passes that it wants to lose, in other words, majority votes for it but it fails, or majority votes against it or succeeds, you see even more frequently that happens. It's still not that much. I mean, it's still under 20%. But the point is that the minority party can win floor votes and does win floor votes. I would note on this chart that there might be a slight downward trend going on there, and that's an important theme of the book. One of the things that I should have mentioned is that this is talking about the minority party, but I take an historical approach, so I start from 1970 and go through the 2010, 2012. And so part of the book is about how things have changed over time. So let me talk about that in just a sec. This slide just summarizes what I've said. The minority party cares about more than just power. And its actions, things it does, are at times associated with success, not always, but at times. But things have changed, no doubt about it. In 1970, the minority party had more opportunities to legislate. Most or a majority of floor rules for the rules for considering bills were open or largely open so that you could offer amendments. There was more of a focus on legislating, arguably, than messaging. What's happened is, for a number of reasons that I discuss in the book, opportunities for the minority party to legislate directly have shrunk. And so if you think about a stream and block that stream, the water still has to flow somewhere. So the minority party either finds other ways to influence legislation, or it finds other avenues or outlets for its energy. And one of those biggest ones is messaging. Messaging is very important. So now amendments aren't necessarily offered to influence a bill, but rather to send a message. Roy Blunt, who was, when he was in the House of Representatives after the 2006 elections, and the Republicans were in the minority, he wrote a memo to Republicans saying, look, we need to offer key amendments or motions to recommit, which is the guaranteed amendment to the minority party, that will either win, they'll pass, or they'll make Nancy Pelosi and Democrats look bad. Either way, we win. Right? So messaging, it becomes central to what the minority party does with the more classic legislative tools that were at its disposal. And at the end of the book, I talk about whether I think that's good or bad. It's my chance to get on the soapbox and give my 2 cents, but I'll refrain from doing that unless people want me to. So that's the book, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. Yes, Rochelle.
This might be a little off base, but could you make an argument that in this current Congress, the majority party is acting as if it almost were still in the minority, that because it's so splintered, it's having difficulty moving its agenda, and especially how it deals with the White House, that it acts as if it were in the minority, and its basic tactic is one of obstruction.
I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I think you're right, and there's two specific aspects to that. So part of it is about the divisions within the Republican Party. And as I discuss in the book, unity for a minority is really important, especially relative to the majority party, because if they're more unified, they can really put the majority party in the spot. I mean, if you imagine the House Democrats being more divided than House Republicans, then perhaps Boehner and now Ryan would have an easier time of it. But because the Democrats stay unified, it really forces the Republicans to have to deal with the conservative wing of their party. It makes it difficult for them to govern. Now, whether they're acting as a minority in that respect or just a very frustrated majority, I'm not sure. But unity is an important theme for a minority. They've got to stay unified. And you see Nancy Pelosi say that, John Boehner say that when they were in the minority. You've got to be unified to exploit those opportunities. But the other thing you mentioned about their strategic approach to Obama is a theme that I touch upon in the book, probably not as much as I should, which is that a party could be in the majority but still act like they're in the minority. And likewise, a party can be in the minority but still act like they're in the majority. So some of the interviews I did for the book were with Democrats who had been in the House after 1994, and they were frustrated that no one there, almost without an exception, knew what it was like to be in the minority. So they were saying, well, we'll just work with Gingrich and we'll figure that. And their leader said, no, we can't do it. We're not legislators anymore. We're not going to get anything, particularly with that, with Gingrich and the leadership. So we have to be more oppositional. And I've heard the same argument with Republicans, that even though they're in the majority, they were in the minority for so long that there's still a legacy of that from 30 years ago now, 20 years ago, still acting as if they need to message and need to oppose as opposed to legislate. So there is a way in which how many seats you have is necessary but not sufficient condition to like having the mentality you need. Yes, sir.
I'm particularly struck by your findings on 1-minute speeches. I'm going to keep that in mind the next time my boss asks me to write one. But I was wondering in which ways the minority party has been most effective at leveraging the discussion or shifting the narrative. Where is the correlation between the various things, whether it's 1 minute or special orders or anything else that you may have found?
Matt, could you repeat the question?
Yes, right. So the question is, did I find any examples or instances in which messaging in general was most effective? Is that correct? Well, the short answer is in the contemporary Congress, not many. The best examples that I could find are from times when new messaging tactics were first developed. So the use of 1 minute in a partisan fashion, which really came about in the late 70s, Republicans started doing it. That really, Democrats really didn't know what to do about that at first. They said, well, why are you so angry at us and talking about Ronald Reagan all the time? And then again, Republicans in 1993-94, they were still in the minority. They had developed, Robert Michael had developed this in part because he was concerned about Newt Gingrich possibly, being so assertive. He wanted to show that he was also a leader of the party. So he set up a team of Republicans who would use 1 minute, but they used them in a different way. They did sort of top 10 lists and catchy song tunes, and that got the press's attention more than the previous use had been. So there's a way in which now it's hard to see standard messaging tactics having much of an effect, or at least getting much attention. But as I argue in the book, innovation and innovation, coming up with new ideas, new ways of doing things, can be more effective, at least in the short run. Yes?
Did you look at all of the committee process and the minorities' influence within committees?
Repeat again.
Yes, did I look at committees in the book? And the answer is no. It was really sort of the scope. I had to limit it at some point, which is a shame because I think that itself could be a whole nother book. There are, first of all, on the one hand, ways in which minority party members can have more influence in a committee, depending on who the chair is and the balance of power and what the issues are, if it's transportation versus, say, judiciary. At the same time, some of the best examples I found of obstruction and messaging were in committees, which I just didn't use in the book. So in some ways, committees can be a model for more collaborative governance and less partisanship. On the other hand, they can be just a microcosm of the way the House as a whole operates. But maybe that'll be my next project. Yeah.
I can think of a lot of things to say, which is a compliment. But just to limit myself to maybe one thing that's more of a comment and then a question. Number one, I think that you, in stating we talked about obstruction by means other than filibustering, and I think that I would caution that there's at least a use of the word filibuster that would make it essentially synonymous with obstruction and would not include only extended debate, which are the possibilities of which, of course, are limited by the rules of the House. And there are other uses of the term, too. So I wouldn't even have made the remark about whether what they're doing constitutes filibustering or not, but the point about it being obstruction stands on its own. More as a query, I was a little surprised that in discussing messaging tactics, you didn't include amendments as a possibility. Certainly, putting up an amendment, and you did talk about that in effect later on in terms of, we'll put up this proposition that they're either going to have to vote in favor of or look bad. That's essentially a messaging kind of activity, I would have thought. And so doesn't it come under that category and fall under that class as well?
Right. So I had to be, first of all, the first point is very well taken. And I guess I use the word filibuster because that is sort of it's the Senate doing extended debate. But obviously, it's more than just that. So I appreciate that point of clarification. With regards to amendments as messaging, yes, I talk about that in the book. But I had to be careful in creating these categories between the vehicle, the actual thing, right? Is it an amendment or is it a speech? And its intent. So if I put amendments into messaging, then that I was worried would confuse things because that's not the same thing as giving a 1 minute speech, which is clearly messaging, or press conferences, which I also talk about. But I do discuss that in the book and in the legislating chapter, as well as in the conclusion, that these legislating tools, whether it's amendments, motions to recommit, discharge petitions, these have become effectively messaging tools. So actually, and for instance, I think it was in the 2007, 2008, Republicans wanted a bill to be considered that would have eased regulations on oil drilling, and they did at least 2 or 3, maybe 4 discharge petitions on the same bill, basically. What they were doing was saying, this is how much we care about it, and those Democrats are bottling it up. That's a messaging tool, right? So I'm glad you raised that, but I did want to distinguish that so it didn't get confusing for the reader. Yes, sir.
How prevalent was the Hastert rule philosophy before Hastert?
So before Hastert, there was an understanding that you avoided bringing bills to the floor that would pass because of the minority party. But it was never discussed as an actual rule. And so before Hastert, and certainly before Gingrich, there were speakers who did, quote unquote, violate the Hastert rule. Tom Foley did it, for instance, with the North American Free Trade Agreement. Majority Democrats voted against it, but it still passed. And it was not seen then as some kind of vote of no confidence. Right? You did it sparingly, but if it was important to you or to the party or to the country or the president, then you would do it, and it was sort of understood. I think what's interesting now is that not only is it called a rule, which is somewhat confusing to people, but that some Republicans have actually wanted to make it a rule and change the House Republican rules so that you can't do that. But I think as we've seen in recent years, if you do that, that really ties the hands of party leaders. And sometimes you just got to get something passed. And you know it's not, your party's not going to like it, but it's got to get done. So there's a way in which it's a useful tool or useful technique for party leaders, albeit one that is used sparingly. Yes?
In terms of tactics, did you look at all at new, or well, relatively not new anymore, communication technologies and the ability of the minority party to develop constituencies beyond their traditional district basis?
Yes, so the question is, did I look at novel forms of communication and technology by lawmakers? Short answer is no. But it's a really important topic, actually. Because the book takes a 40-year span, I kind of wanted to kind of control for as many things as possible. And at the time I started doing this, it was still pretty new, the use of Twitter and Facebook by the minority party. So I opted to kind of leave that off leave that out. Having said that, though, I think it's a great subject and it's clearly being used. And I would not be surprised if the data shows that the minority party's done it first. In fact, my guess would be that's absolutely right. So that if you're in the minority, how do you get the word out to people? Well, you tweet. Those Democrats, look what they did today. Oh, I can't get to the floor, blah, 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 blah. And then what happens, again, is you have innovation, and then you have replication. So the other party says, oh, well, we should do that too, either in the majority or the minority, and then they start doing it. A lot of innovation of tactics comes from the minority party in the House because they have fewer options. They've got to come up with new things. So I didn't look at it, but it's really important and would be a good project. Yeah. Yes?
On the motion to adjourn, where you found there had been some success, what was the mechanism for that? And was there negotiation during the quorum call, or how did that happen?
Yeah, because it's aggregate, we're talking a number of cases, so I couldn't do a case-by-case analysis to figure it out. Sometimes there were news reports where they said, this happened. A lot of it was just kind of behind closed doors. That's why I say inference. It's hard to know for sure. But it certainly seemed to be the case that you would have someone in the minority complain and do one of these motions, and especially if they kept doing them over and over and over. And sometimes the majority would just pull the bill from the floor and say, we're done for the day. And then the next day they'd come back and something had changed. So it certainly would suggest there was some kind of negotiation going on.
Is the speaker required to recognize if it's for purposes of delay?
Ahaha, right. So it's a privileged motion, but the House rules also say that the speaker does not have to entertain dilatory motions. I can't think of an example of a speaker refusing to, at least in the modern era, recognize someone to do a motion to rise or adjourn for that purpose. Usually what happens is they just the speaker just adjourns, goes into recess kind of thing. So for instance, Republicans did this on an agriculture bill, ag spending bill in the early 1990s. They were upset about something else, but they introduced an amendment that would cut spending by $50,050, which was exactly 1% of the budget. And then they just got up and talked about child health care. And then that amendment failed. And someone introduced an amendment that cut $100,000 and $100. And then they just talked more about, now at that point, I suppose the speaker could have said, I'm not going to recognize the next amendment. But instead, they just adjourned for the day. Yeah. Right. I think we're out of time. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
Great. Well, I want to thank Matt. His presentation is as clear as his book. He really worked hard at making this understandable. One of the things I liked best was all this positive talk about government and politics. It really is refreshing in many ways, and it gave us a nice insight into CRS and a very important, obviously an important part of our library, and one that I hope that will participate in helping us co-sponsor other Books and Beyond programs. There's going to be a book signing for Matt right in the back. Please buy the book at the Library of Congress discount. And let's close by giving Matt Breen another round of applause for a great job.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.